anyone who thinks this is at all subversive or brave or makes them some kind of revolutionary needs to get their eyes checked, because this is neoliberalism 101. Everybody, when your politics align with that of Nike and the General Electric in America, then what sort of revolutionary are you?
Hello and welcome to the Ann and Phelim Scoop. I'm Phelim McAleer. Anne McElhinney is travelling today, so you'll just have my dulcet tones and beautiful visage. Happy BloomsDay. I'm recording this on BloomsDay. More of that anon. What else is on the show today? Whilst LA burns for the poor benighted immigrants, peacefully burns. Peaceful protests. Very peaceful, except for the burning. Northern Ireland, my little home country, has become the latest part of Europe to burn for the completely opposite reason, against the immigrants. So we interview someone who reveals how Europe is now at long last sharing the American skepticism towards immigration, and how in reality Donald Trump is more European than most European politicians. And finally, we learn that in at least one jurisdiction, an unborn baby is a fully formed human and is entitled to all the protections that adults receive. We reveal how killing his unborn baby has led to a man facing a capital murder charge. And among much depressing news from Israel, and we have some joyful news about one of the characters in our play, in our October 7th play. She lived through a nightmare day, but now she has some joy. So we'll give you some details on that. And we bring you some information about the commute on LA's freeways. So yes, as you probably know, we are based in Los Angeles, which has been on fire basically for the last several days. I think it's calmed down a little bit now, but there are many terrible things about the riots: the destruction, the violence, the injuries, the attacks on the Waymos. How will no one think of the Waymos? Waymos, for those who don't know, Waymos are driverless cars that I believe are only in Los Angeles and San Francisco, and they burned 3 or 4 of them. The monsters. Will no one think of the Waymos? I think possibly one of the really bad aspects of the riots in Los Angeles was constantly being told by the media that they're peaceful and that it's isolated to a small part of Los Angeles, etc. Pearl Harbor was isolated to a small part of the United States, a remote island off the mainland of the United States. The nuclear bomb in Japan was one city in among many in Japan. This is ludicrous. This is ludicrous. These are violent people. And the cops took 2 hours to arrive. Don't forget that. 2 hours to arrive to protect federal officers. And we saw what happened in 2020 with the riots for St. George or Floyd, where they destroyed billions. They created billions of dollars worth of damage in Los Angeles and across the United States, tens of billions. They killed over 20 people. Federalize it all, I say, and let God sort it out. So it's very interesting that they're trying to riot in Los Angeles in favor of immigrants, whereas most people, it's a losing issue for the government. It's a losing issue for the Democrats. I think 80 or 90% of people, according to polls, are in favor of Trump's policies. In Europe, this is a very European attitude, as Europe becomes more and more anti-illegal immigrant. In the country I was brought up in, the province of Northern Ireland, they're now rioting over an attack by 2 immigrants on a young girl in a town called Ballymena. They rioted in Dublin recently after a immigrant knifed small school children. They rioted in England. It's an international story, and we have searched for the best person to try and give you that context. So we're going to go over now and talk to Michael Murphy. He's a journalist with the Daily Telegraph. He's made documentaries. He has this brilliant cross-border international experience that will really bring home to you why the American skepticism of immigration is not unique and is actually quite popular among the populists. Let's go over to that interview I did earlier. So Michael Murphy is a journalist and documentary filmmaker at the UK Telegraph, at the Spectator, Canada's National Post. Last year, he released a documentary on YouTube, Ireland is Full. It has achieved 3 million views. There are less than 5 million people in Ireland, so it has a massive audience. Michael is saying what many European journalists are afraid to say. So welcome to the show, Michael.
Thank you, Phelim.
I wanted to bring you on because I think in America, where we're based, there's a tendency for people to think that, we're an aberration caring about immigration. It's the biggest issue, I think, here, immigration, law and order, which are kind of the same issue sometimes. But it's a big story in Europe. But it's not really reflected in the political discourse, even the journalistic discourse. We don't know much about it here. Tell us, I want to start most recently. There's been unrest, rioting in my home country, Northern Ireland, in Ballymena. Tell us about that. And then if you could expand out a little bit to tell us about the recent riots in Dublin and Southport, to show that how it's a topic that's coming to the top of the agenda one way or the other.
Sure. Well, Saturday before last, on June the 7th, I think it was, there were reports that a local Northern Irish girl had been assaulted, allegedly by 2 Romanian teenagers. These Romanian teenagers later appeared in court, needing a translator from English into Romanian. The reaction to that, in Ballymena, first locally, and then it started to spread, away from where the incident had initially happened, was quite typical of what we've seen in similar riots in Dublin in 2023, in Southport in 2024 in the UK, where there is a flashpoint, some kind of outrage where a migrant has or a migrant descended person has committed, either a vicious assault, in this case, an attempted sexual assault, and the local community have come out and things have got very violent very quickly. Mm-hmm. And in the case of Ballymena, it went on for a few days. I think you're right to draw the comparison between Southport and the Dublin riots of 2023. In the sense that I think these crimes tap into the deepest some of the deepest tendencies in the human condition, let alone, the sort of modern day sensibilities of, somebody has assaulted a local child or a local girl, and they're not from this country. They don't. In the case of these boys from Romania, they haven't learned to speak the language. So people get more angry about these sorts of things than they would if, this had been a sort of intra-local issue. And, some people would say rightly so, because, while the problem of violence or assaults of this kind will always be with us, but there's yes. the question of, well, did we need more of it? Did we need to import a cohort? Obviously, that does not excuse the violence or the sort of pogrom-style activities that we saw in Northern Ireland after, needless to say.
Yeah, you're right. The violence will always be with us, and nobody needs to tell someone from Northern Ireland about violence. But, I mean, Southport, this was a person who went in and stabbed children at a Taylor Swift dance recital. Dublin, that was another stabbing of children outside a school. I think it's the scale of the violence, it's the type of violence. Mm-hmm. Ireland's supposed to be homophobic apparently, or whatever. But the only person who murdered gay people by cutting their throats was an immigrant, a Muslim immigrant in Sligo. So there is the violent, I'm not trying to pretend that Northern Ireland or Dublin or the UK is violence free, but there is a type of violence, there's a tendency for certain types of violence that is imported. Let's be honest about it. So there's these riots, but am I right in saying that it hasn't filtered up to the political classes, or is that changing?
Well, I think it depends where you look. In Britain, I think it's fair to say now that every single mainstream party, Reform, the Conservatives, and Labour, are all trying desperately to outdo each other on the question of immigration. So there is really very little space in mainstream politics now for a pro mass migration policy platform. So I think that's significant. I think if you look to Dublin, there's a new Justice Minister, Jim O'Callaghan, who is, saying very hawkish things on immigration compared to his predecessors, saying, boasting about deportations and things that would have been branded far right in Ireland only a few years ago, and now the government policy. And I think this is a very, if you've been, as I imagine you have, paying attention to developments in Britain as well, this is often the case. The far right will often act as a kind of think tank for the next government and write their policies for them. And so I think if you judge politicians on what they say, then certainly that this has had some cut through and they've realised that this is an issue. I mean, Northern Ireland's a different story because they have a kind of, government in name only. And so I think that there's definitely, the acknowledgement that this is something that governments have to address if they want to, stay in power and fend off the sort of boogeyman populist forces that have emerged. But more notably in Britain than in Ireland, it has to be said.
Yes.
And but if you judge them by their actions, I think that's a different story entirely. We've proved in Britain to be completely unable to stop armies of mostly young men in dinghies washing up on our shores every day. And in Ireland, the migration has gone down slightly compared to the last few years in comparable terms, but they really made a dent in it? Not as far as I can tell.
So there are, I think, thousands of young men washing up on Britain's shores every week. There are thousands of people arriving in Ireland every month claiming asylum. Do you believe? Can we believe the politicians when they say there's nothing they can do? Because that was the allegation of the Biden administration. There's nothing we can do. It's an economic problem. Trump got in, and on day it's over. The border is closed, and I don't even think they're trying to sue him to open the border. They're suing him to open everything else and try and in the courts to overturn everything. How much of it is, as you say, their actions belie their words, but how much of it is it solvable? Is it political will? And I want to get on then, why are they not more interested in solving this problem? But is it solvable in your opinion?
I think that the question of, illegal migrants washing up on British shores and claiming asylum, making dubious claims to asylum, it has to be said, is probably one of the most solvable policy issues we have in the country. I was at a talk in Oxford recently with Dominic Cummings, where he said he convened a meeting with the Navy and the Special Forces and the Home Office, and that they put their heads together and they found that actually that stopping the boats could be done in a matter of days. What you'd have is effectively a naval blockade of the coast. It's only a small part of the coast really that needs to be guarded, and just a policy that no boat is to land. Any boats that do try and land are to be turned round and to be sent back to where they came from. And the special forces are to be given directives to go directly after the smugglers. And so all of a sudden you've got these people smugglers whose cost of business has just gone up because they've got to worry about the British SAS kicking in their door, in the crack of dawn. Yeah. And that then makes the business model a lot less lucrative. People from developing countries aren't going to pay thousands of pounds if they see that there's very little prospect of success, and the smugglers are going to probably start sending the people elsewhere. So in that sense, operationally, it's eminently achievable. It's more the adherence to the Human Rights Act and the ECHR combined, which tie our hands on this, which would actually make such an order from the Prime Minister unenforceable because it would be slapped down by a judge.
Yeah. Okay. So there's judges. So, I mean, there's a lot in what you said there. I mean, I just want to put it in context for people and correct me if I'm wrong. So these people come from France, which under the old asylum rules, or maybe still existing asylum rules, you're supposed to claim asylum in the first safe country you land in. So these people cross Europe. A lot of them come from Albania. They come from further afield, Afghanistan, Pakistan. They cross Europe. I don't know where they come, Eastern Europe, where they come from, Paris, Germany, Belgium. They cross these countries, but they get on a boat and then they arrive on the shores of England, southern England, and claim asylum. Then they're given a hotel room, a mobile phone, welfare, food, facilities, medical facilities, treatment, etc., which is creating a lot of animosity. That's what's happened. So what happened to the old rule of you have to claim in the last country you were in? Shouldn't they be immediately deported? And then if the government wants to stop this, they're still under European... explain to people why Brexit hasn't meant that Britain controls its own borders now.
Well, that law, which I think was a part of the Dublin Treaty, which Ireland gave its name to, its capital city's name, essentially didn't survive first contact with geographical reality, because the migrants are coming north through the Mediterranean, and so there's a bottleneck in those southern Mediterranean countries like Greece and Italy, and eventually, so essentially, under that law or agreement, those countries would have had to take all the migrants, and they saw that this was patently unfair and untenable. So basically, they started waving the migrants through, turning a blind eye to them going north. And the migrants, in cahoots with various non-governmental organizations and charities, figured out how to game the system. They would lose their documents. Their English would suddenly become a bit more hazy when they had to describe exactly how they'd got to Germany or France or Britain. And so that system just collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. And it also has to be said that the countries with the most generous social services and inducements for foreigners or asylum seekers rather are those northern European countries like Germany, France, and mainly Britain. And so I think that Dublin was always going to prove an inadequate solution to this problem. And I think it also represents how, we pick the legislation sort of a la carte that we like to stick to. We hold up, the ECHR as something that is gospel. But then when we have a treaty that all member states have agreed to, we kind of quietly brush it under the rug. Well, as to your second question, I think that one underappreciated aspect of, the spike that we saw after Brexit, especially after the pandemic, was that was almost, sometimes it's called the Boris wave in this country because it coincided with Boris Johnson's premiership. That was seen, across Europe and indeed in America as well, where there was this massive uptick as the world opened up after COVID. And I think that's, a number of reasons, but one that can't be ignored and is just a sort of fact of economic sort of gravity, is that during lockdown, the stresses that were placed on the developing world in terms of loss of business, loss of opportunities, poverty, etc., those and the inability to move, that then created a kind of pressure cooker that was released after the world opened up. And so every country saw this massive spike, and it was the countries that offered the most generous inducements that were the chief beneficiaries of it, as it were.
So yes, so incentives. So Britain, so are you saying the migrants respond to economic incentives? So Britain obviously has very generous benefits. I know Ireland has very generous benefits, and I know California has very generous benefits where we live, and shockingly, that's where the migrants come. It's like that thing they used to say to the bank robber, why did you rob banks? Because that's where the money is. So you're saying migrants respond to these incentives. Why? Actually, it's kind of the theme of this interview. What is driving these politicians who are unable to tackle this? Why are Irish politicians not responding to the population? Why are they not, why? What's the motivation? Let's say the Irish ruling class, the politicians, they seem to just be totally disconnected. The elites. Tell us, is that true, and why?
I think the motivations of the political class or the elites in general, including the media, etc., who are, at this stage apologists for a policy that has proven catastrophic everywhere it's been tried, are, take on a slightly different flavor wherever you go. From what I've read about California in general, I've read a brilliant book by Michael Schellenberger, San Francisco. I think there's just a sort of complete ideological capture about how, essentially anything that is any outcome that befalls anybody that is suboptimal, like they're a drug addict or they're homeless or they're a criminal, is somehow not their fault. And this is it's the structures of the state or, the racism or prejudice of some kind. And it's this complete absolution of anybody for any moral responsibility. And I think that mentality is regnant in Britain and in Ireland to some extent as well. So I think there's one thing. It's like that people are not responsible for the bad outcomes that befall them. And I think as well, in Ireland, for example, there is a sense among the political class that they want to be the best boys and girls in the European club.
Absolutely.
And I think that there was a real collapse in confidence among the Irish political class in the sort of 2000s in their ability to govern their own affairs. And I think two things primarily contributed to that. One was the emergence, the sort of full exposure of the Catholic abuse scandals towards the end of the 90s and the early noughties, which I think really collapsed was the final death knell for the prevailing system of ethics in Ireland. And, into that vacuum came a lot of other new ideas about, sort of racial and sexual dogmas that they had imported from America. Then, obviously, the financial crash hit Ireland very hard in 2008 onwards, and the following years just saw a sort of veritable car boot sale of sovereign functions of the Irish state handed over to Europe. And so I think that the sort of prevailing consensus among the Irish political establishment is that they are better off as a part of Europe, and that actually if they sort of let Europe be the driving force of Irish politics, then that Ireland will somehow be better than the sum of its parts. That will be better all round, and that Europe are the sensibles, and that we need to follow in that direction. So I think that's the kind of situation in Ireland. It has to be said, actually, a lot of Irish politicians are. I don't want to be unkind, but I think some of their backgrounds...
Go ahead. Go on. As an Irishman, I give you permission. Well, by the way, I should establish you have an English accent, but I assume with a name like Michael Murphy that you probably have generational privilege to insult the Irish, do you?
It depends who you ask. Some people are very puritanical about what it means to be Irish. I definitely have a free pass among my dad's friends, that's for sure.
Okay. It's actually, I was kind of joking there, but it's very interesting. If I'm out covering a political rally here in California and ask progressives awkward questions that they don't like, it takes them 2 seconds to say, "You're not from here. How dare you ask me this question?" They become radically intolerant of immigrants once you start asking awkward questions. And I think the Irish progressive class are probably the same. Your name may be Michael Murphy and you may be a second or third generation Irish person. And they believe that the moment someone from Africa arrives in Ireland, they are entitled to the full rights and privileges of being an Irish citizen. But once you ask them an awkward question, suddenly they become intolerant of outsiders.
Well, that's very common, I feel. I mean, it's sort of liberal in the streets, nationalist in the sheets. We see this with a lot of American politicians as well. You know, when was it Ilhan Omar, when she was talking about some kind of internecine struggle in Somalia or Somaliland, started speaking in the most nativistic language imaginable that you couldn't imagine her using in an American context. So yeah, there's some of that, all right. It's the same with the Scottish nationalists, incidentally. They own and Sinn Féin. They're national, you know, they only, nationalism is only trotted out when it's to bash the English.
Correct.
And then anybody else, there's, you know, that's xenophobic. And so it's become a kind of performative nationalism where they're they're sort of reheating old grievances where, you know, that these things are sort of paling in significance now.
I mean, there's so many sides to this, and you're right. The Irish elite, they want to be the best Europeans, and there's a sense also, and I think, you know, you get that with a lot of politicians, but it's a very Irish thing. Tony Blair was that to a certain extent, that almost being prime minister of your own country is a junior job compared to the great European experiment. Now, you don't get that. Obama had a little bit of that, but you know, generally when you're president of the United States, it's viewed as your final job. I want to ask you about Nigel Farage. He has been vocal. So Nigel Farage, for all our viewers, is the leader of the Reform Party. He was the person behind the Brexit vote, really, and a friend of President Trump's. He has been the most vocal anti-immigration leader of a party and is taking votes from Labour Party and the Conservative Party. Now, he has softened a little, hasn't he, on immigration? So do you think his rhetoric is the same or different from the other political elites who say one thing but when empowered do the opposite?
I think that the landscape in the UK now politically on immigration is becoming quite messy, and Farage, who was once the boogeyman of the liberal left, you know, for 20 or 30 years, he was held up as, you know, this far right fearmonger. He's now starting to be outflanked on immigration by former Tory wets like Robert Jenrick, or a former member of Reform, Rupert Lowe. So you know, Rupert Lowe will come out and say something like, all illegal migrants in Britain should be deported. And for Farage, who's, you know, to his credit, he's been in the trenches for the last 25 years, having to weather smear campaigns and very much going against the prevailing cultural headwinds. And so he's learned to possibly be overly cautious and to pick his battles judiciously. But the sort of the new political class now that are coming up on the right haven't had that experience, and so he's now in danger where, you know, he's created this marvelous party that Reform that has you know, essentially threatens to be the biggest upheaval in British politics, certainly since Brexit, but in party politics in potentially in under a century. And
since the decline of the Liberal Party.
Of course, yeah, and so he's in danger of, you know, if he gets outflanked by some of these other people on immigration, when immigration is essentially Reform's raison d'etre, he will possibly snatch defeat from the jaws of victory.
Possibly, just to put it in context. I mean, Nigel Farage is, you've got the Democrats here and the Republicans here. Nigel Farage is coming up with a third party that is threatening to blow away either the Conservative or he's taking votes from both parties. Now, it's very, very difficult to do it. Well, it's very difficult to do it in the States because of the presidential system. It's very difficult to do it in the UK because of the first past the post system. But I think what will happen if the voters think the problem is that with first past the post, you can feel your vote is wasted if you give it to a protest party. But he's moving beyond the protest party stage now. He's moving to, I can win this seat. And these historic parties, the Labour Party and the Conservative Party that have dominated British politics for a century, the Conservative Party has dominated British politics for more than a century, they're in danger of disappearing.
Well, it's the oldest political party in the world, and that's a Conservative Party at least. And that's in danger of being swept into the dustbin of history.
Wow. So I just, just to reiterate to people, in America who may think that their concerns about immigration are somehow, I mean, we are always told in America we're different and we're kind of behind the times, or, more extreme. I mean, this is going to destroy this could destroy the oldest political party on the planet. The same thing with Irish politics. It could destroy the two parties that have dominated, actually the three parties that have dominated Irish politics since the foundation of the state: Sinn Féin, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. They're in danger of being fragmented or swept aside by a populist wave. Now, the Irish situation is disorganised. There's no Farage there. But as we've seen in maybe the moment will make some man, and there'll be a Trump or a Farage arising. But there's a wave of history sweeping the world at the moment, and America's not alone.
No, the Irish situation is very interesting because you have this coalition ruling almost uniparty of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, who have they have ruled Ireland since its founding for over 100 years, and the difference between them is, as parties, is often hard to distinguish, especially in recent years, when in 2017-18, I think Sinn Féin had a very good result, and essentially Ireland became a three-party and not a two-party system. Féin, of course, being Gaelic for, I think it's ourselves alone.
I just want to say, I was explaining the Irish political system to a journalist in their 20s from New York, and she was asking about it, and I said, and she says, "What does Sinn Féin mean?" I said, "Ourselves alone." And she goes, "That's really ironic, because they're one of the pro-immigration parties now."
They should change it to ourselves and everyone else, except for the English. And so Sinn Féin was a major political disruptor. I'd say if you were to describe their modern incarnation, they started off as obviously a nativist Republican party, the sort of the political wing of the IRA. Famously, so. And the modern iteration of Sinn Féin under Mary Lou McDonald has kept the socialist left wing economic ideals of the party, but has completely lost the right wing nationalist Republican sentiment. Apart from in a few cases when you talk about the Troubles or the British,
yes,
and they've replaced that with left-wing identitarianism. So you will now see Sinn Féin at pride marches, in mosques. Yes. You'll often see Mary Lou McDonald sporting a chador, as if this is the integral to the culture of Ireland, as her predecessors would have seen it. And so they took the establishment by surprise in, I think it was 2018, when they became the roughly equivalent size of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. And it looked like they were going to be able to continue riding that sort of left-wing populist discontent, very popular among students and young people who perhaps don't remember the Troubles and all of the violence.
Well, it was an anti-establishment too, and it was. I think it was part of the anti-establishment wave. There was Trump and Brexit. There was this throw them all out. So you go ahead, and then what happened? Tell us the twist in the tale, the twist you didn't see coming.
Well, so imagine, of all the things that Sinn Féin would start hemorrhaging voters from, it's mass immigration. When the government in Ireland starts, there's a massive uptick in the number of, especially asylum seekers arriving in Ireland, making very dubious claims to asylum. Yes. Similar picture as in Europe, mostly young men who are just being bussed into rural Irish towns and parts of the inner city which are quite deprived, with no warning to locals, and they're just told to put up and shut up. And naturally, this caused a lot of consternation. I think in 2023 and 24 combined, there must have been north of 500 grassroots protests around the country, some of which lasted for months on end.
Just to put it in context, for people, you have villages where the population would double overnight because the only hotel would be filled with 150 asylum seekers in the village. Okay, maybe not double. A village of 300 people, suddenly 150 people. I know a town not far from where I'm at home where the population was doubled by 1,500. A small large town. The top population was doubled because it was 1,500 people arrived into hotels and holiday homes in the area. So obviously that created a backlash. Tell us about that.
Sure. I mean, I spent a fair bit of time in Roscrea, for example, where at the time that I was filming my documentary, it had gone from a town of roughly, I think, 4,000 to 5,000. That's incredible change.
1,000 people arrived overnight.
Not overnight. This was a sort of trickle, but there were 230 due to arrive practically overnight to occupy the town's only hotel.
Sorry, I interrupted you earlier. You were talking about Sinn Féin's demand.
Sure. Yeah. So Sinn Féin, could this would have been an amazing political opportunity for Sinn Féin to make hay and criticise the government, but there was virtually no daylight between their position and the government's. They said we have our international obligations to these dubious asylum seekers. And we need to show compassion, and actually anybody who criticizes this is far right or xenophobic. That's correct. So I think the main thrust of the anger especially in the working class inner city parts of Dublin, which would have been typically like Sinn Féin strongholds, because people still lionize the legacy of the sort of fallen martyrs, Padraig Pearse and the rest of it. They saw the government as being, lily-livered or on the subject, but they saw Sinn Féin as traitors, and you would hear it on the marches. They would be chanting Sinn Féin are traitors, and so the real anger was directed at them.
Oh, it's unbelievable. So the establishment. So if you are canvassing for one of the establishment parties, you can go into these working class, rough areas and ask for your vote. Sinn Féin found it hard. They would almost get violently rejected from communities now if they went in to ask for their vote in what used to be their base, because they're seen as traitors, whereas the establishment politicians are just establishment politicians.
Well, there's nothing like the fury of the towards the apostate.
Yes, somewhat. What was it? No one hates you as well as someone who used to love you.
Well, there you go. This is a very messy divorce between Sinn Féin and much of their base.
I mean, you talk about Padraig Pearse there, who's one of the leaders of the 1916 Rising. One of the founding fathers of the Irish state, and James Connolly, who was the socialist element of the 1916 Rising. He famously said, "What's the point in getting rid of Britain from Ireland if we just change the post boxes from red to green?" And he was saying we have to overturn the economic system. But actually, we've now gone from the post boxes from red to green to pride colours. And, I'm not...
Which, funnily enough, are the same flags that you will see decked out on the largest multinational corporations in the world. And so... anyone who thinks this is at all subversive or brave or makes them some kind of revolutionary needs to get their eyes checked, because this is neoliberalism 101. Everybody, when your politics align with that of Nike and the General Electric in America, then what sort of revolutionary are you?
Yeah. Okay, listen, Michael, we have to go here It's very, very interesting to see the similarities and the differences between Ireland, UK, Europe, and America, and you're perfectly positioned to explain all that. And it's such a rich topic. We could talk all day about it. But thank you very much for coming on the show. We'll have you back on. When's the next election in the UK? It won't be for a while, I suppose.
Oh, it won't be for another three years, I think. But a week is a long time in politics, so who knows?
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Well, thank you, Michael, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you, Phelim.
So very interesting. The anti-immigration surge is probably going to destroy the oldest political party in the world. It has already changed one of the established political parties in America. The Republicans are now an anti-illegal immigrant party. They always said they were, but they weren't. It was like, as Michael said, all the parties in the UK now pretend to be anti-illegal immigrant. They're not. The immigrant issue has changed the Republican Party. It has not changed political parties in Ireland, but that's an outlier. So this is the biggest issue of our time at the moment. And don't feel like you're racist. Don't feel like you're somehow an outlier. This is the issue of our ages, and you need to be loud and proud about it, to coin a phrase that's popular at the moment. So, and other things that are going on. Oh, actually, I wanted to just include, this is what we see in our morning commute on the freeways here. Other people have trucks and cars. We have militarized vehicles. So that's what you see in the 405 on a Monday morning. So, and the other big news of the day, I suppose, is the Israel-Iran war. Israel attacked Iran. Iran has responded. Hundreds of people have been killed, mostly in Iran. I think a few dozen now have been killed in Israel. The Iron Dome is not as protective as they would hope. Iran has been funding anti-Israeli terrorist organizations for decades. Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis in Yemen. And they are apparently, allegedly, weeks or months away from getting a nuclear bomb. And this is not your grandpa's nuclear bomb. These are the Iranian regime. The Iranian Islamist regime. And I think they're quite open. They will use a nuclear bomb to wipe Israel off the map. And so Israel felt that was intolerable, as you would, and so tried to do what they did to Hezbollah in the Lebanon and wipe out the leadership, try and decapitate the monster to undermine it and destroy it. Let's see how successful they have been. Let's see how successful they will be. Good news from Israel. You may remember our October 7 play, where after October 7, Ann and I went to Israel, interviewed people about their day, about the day that saw the biggest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. A lot of sadness, a lot of tragedy, but also hope. People survived. People wanted to fight on. People are going to live. And one of the most powerful stories was from Shani Arditi. There's a picture of her. We interviewed her. She was the last person we interviewed in Israel. And funny, I before I went to Israel, I made a pact with myself. I knew I was going to be very tired. And I said, we're going to take every interview we are offered, even if we are exhausted, because I know this is the way it works. It's always that interview that you think, oh, I won't go into it. I won't. It's always the best interview. That's just the way of journalism. So we went and did this interview. We interviewed Shani Arditi. Her story was, my jaw was hitting the ground. She was at the Nova Festival. She saw her friends being massacred around her. She escaped. The people were shot all around her. She hid in a field of thorns under a thorn bush. She sat there for 8 hours. She heard people getting shot all around her. She saw drones. She was shot at. It's a terrible, terrible, tragic story. Now, we're very happy to announce Shani is engaged to her longtime boyfriend, Alon. And I suppose what I would say to that is, they say the best revenge is a happy life. Hamas is on its knees. Hamas is a broken organization. The people of Gaza, who still, unfortunately, support Hamas, maybe they don't, but they're still under the yoke of Hamas. Hamas is a defeated organization. They still have the hostages. As I've always said, if Hamas released the hostages and announced their surrender and handed over their arms, the war in Gaza would end tomorrow. But they're not going to do that. Shani has announced her engagement. The best revenge is a happy life. So she's getting revenge on Hamas, revenge on those people by living her best and happiest life. So congratulations, Shani. It's such a happy story, and we're so happy to bring it to you. Talking of Israel and talking of Jews, today I'm recording this on Monday, June the 16th. This is BloomsDay, which is the day that James Joyce set his novel Ulysses. June the 16th, I think 1905 or 1906, he said it. And it's about one man's walking around Dublin at the turn of the century. And Joyce was a great man to talk about people being alienated from Irish society and alienated from the world in general, but alienated from Irish society. And I think it just shows you the artistry of James Joyce. Who did he choose to represent alienation from Irish society? He didn't choose a young radical who was alienated by Catholicism. He didn't choose a widow. He didn't choose a young woman who felt stifled by conservative society. No, he chose a Jew. There might only have been 1,000 or two Jewish people in Ireland at the time. They didn't make a big demographic bump. They weren't a community that people were particularly interested in. But somehow Joyce recognized the alienation that Irish Jews felt from Ireland and the attitude of the Irish towards the Jews. You know, there's this idea that Ireland was not anti-Semitic. Well, Joyce saw it. Joyce recognized it, and they are still doing it. You know, and now it's become very, very obvious today. Ireland is a country where Jews get spat on in bars, where you can put up a sign outside a pub, no Zionists allowed in this pub, where they cancelled a July the 4th Independence Day celebration in a tourist town in Ireland because somehow America is connected to Israel. I mean, the anti-Semitism is deep and broad in Ireland, and Joyce recognized it a century ago. What a great artist. What a great book, Ulysses. I'm going to finally finish it someday, but it's a great book for dipping in and out of also. So, interesting news out of Texas. For the first time, an unborn baby has been found to have the same legal rights as an adult, as its suspected killer is facing capital murder charges in the state. And this is the first time we believe it's happened in the United States. So Justin Banta, a Justice Department employee, we think is the first man to be charged with capital murder. That's murder that can carry a death penalty, for surreptitiously giving his pregnant girlfriend abortion drugs to make her miscarry. So according to a press release from the Parker County Sheriff's Office in Texas, Banta and the victim were in a romantic relationship when she found out she was pregnant in September 2024. She wanted to keep the baby, and fast forward to the next month, Banta met her for coffee and cookies. The day before, she had a sonogram. The baby had a strong heartbeat. He gave her cookies and coffee, and she then very quickly started to have a miscarriage. And she believed that it was because of drugs he gave. The cops investigated. They raided his house. Allegedly, they have found cookies with the abortion drugs in them. He's been arrested and arraigned on capital murder charges. Now, normally, that's not possible. I mean, we know, for example, Kermit Gosnell was charged with capital murder of babies during abortion. However, all the babies that he was charged with were over 24 weeks old when he murdered them out of the womb. And he murdered them out of the womb. That's because of Pennsylvania's absolutely ridiculous abortion laws, where abortion was legal up to 24 weeks. This man is charged with murdering an unborn baby, a relatively young unborn baby in the womb. It's capital murder. It's not before time. Obviously, it's all allegedly. Maybe, perhaps he's innocent. We have to say that. But it's good that the law is catching up with scientific reality. That the baby has a heartbeat, a baby has eyes, a baby has all the attributes of a human being. And let's watch this case with interest. So that's all for the show today. I want to remind you guys, we are a 501c3. We depend on donations from people like you. So please give what you can. Go to the unreportedstorysociety.com. That's the unreportedstorysociety.com to keep us going, keep doing what we have to do and what we need to do to bring the truth. There's a lot of misinformation out there, and we're bringing you the truth and the best interviews and the best stories. So we will talk to you next week, and thank you very much. Bye.